The dust in Kumasi was the color of dried blood and gold, a fine, omnipresent powder kicked up by the feet of thousands, a testament to the earth that sustained the mightiest kingdom of the Akan people, Ashanti. It was the year 1700, or perhaps a few years after. For the Akan, time was measured less by the cold, ticking mechanism of a European clock and more by the rhythm of the seasons, the rising of the paramount golden stool, Sikadwa, and the lineage of the Ashanti king. At the heart of the empire, under the benevolent yet absolute rule of Osetutu I's legacy, the city was a masterpiece of organized power. Unlike the chaotic trading posts clinging to the coast, Kumasi was inland, insulated, and magnificent. In one of the great compounds of a powerful Oyoko clan, a lineage connected to the high offices of the state, dwelt a young woman known as Nanny. Even in her youth, before the sea swallowed her and spat her out onto the hostile shores of the Caribbean, Nanny was recognized as possessing the coveted sunsum, the distinct spirit or personality that elevates a person. She was tall, with a bearing that suggested she was accustomed to being obeyed, her features sharp and defined, her skin the color of deep river mud, polished smooth by millennia. Nani's family was perhaps connected to the warrior class or the priesthood, those who understood the complex relationship between the visible world of men and the invisible world of the ancestors and the supreme deity, Nyame. She was trained in the rigorous Cremonti tradition, a term that would later become a fearful battle cry half a world away. This training was not merely for war, but for the mind, to read the land, to understand the intent of an enemy's movement before the weapon was drawn, and to utilize the psychological and spiritual forces inherent in the world. She was taught the power of the talking drum from Cromantum, whose complex rhythms could transmit entire battle plans across miles of dense forest. She learned the rituals of the Adinkra symbols, each one a compressed proverb, a philosophy of life, the Sankofa bird, demanding that one return and get it, urging the necessity of learning from the past to build the future. This deep, unshakable cultural foundation was not a luxury, it was the backbone of the Ashanti military and political structure. The Ashanti wealth, the gold that lined their streets and adorned their kings, was a direct result of their military prowess and their centralized, efficient government. But the Ashanti wealth was also their peril. To the south, on the littoral edge of the continent, the British, Dutch, and Portuguese powers had built their colossal stone-faced castles, Elmina, Cape Coast, Onambu. These were not mere trading posts for gold dust and ivory. They were dungeons of the apocalypse, designed to process human beings into chattel. They called this area the Gold Coast, but the wealth they truly desired, the wealth that fueled the Industrial Revolution and built the ports of Bristol and Liverpool, was the endless supply of labor taken from the interior. Nanny, though insulated by the power of Kumasi, was not ignorant of the trade. The Ashanti were too powerful to be raided directly, but they were deeply involved in the commerce, often trading war captives from defeated neighboring groups to the Europeans for firearms, silks, and luxuries. It was a terrible Faustian bargain, security purchased by the blood of others, a common, tragic theme of power dynamics across all continents. The Ashanti believed their own people, those born under the golden stool, were safe. This belief was shattered, not by a direct invasion, but by the relentless, growing demand that pulled at the edges of the empire like a tide of pure evil.
Chapter 2: The Fire Coast. The year is now approximately 1720. The name Naani, like so many powerful names, begins to fade into the terrifying anonymity of the trade. She is captured not in a grand siege, but likely in one of the chaotic, smaller skirmishes that plagued the borders of the expanding Ashanti territory, or perhaps sold by a rival faction seeking to appease the coastal brokers. The exact mechanism of her enslavement is lost to the historical record, a common silence that swallows the individual trauma of millions. But the experience is horrifyingly uniform. She has marched hundreds of miles from the inland forests, bound by a heavy iron yoke around her neck, attached to a chain that links her to dozens of others. This forced march, the Kafu Caravana, is the first crucible. Starvation, dysentery, the constant brutality of the guards, these are designed to break the spirit, to reduce the magnificent Sunsum to a frightened, pliable animal. Many die. Many simply fall and are left. But Naani does not fall. She focuses her mind using the Cromanti discipline to turn her body into a mere vessel for her raging spirit. She observes. She learns the weaknesses and patterns of her captors. She speaks in the whispers of her ancestors to the women marching beside her, forging alliances of survival that will prove lethal to the British later on. The destination? Cape Coast Castle. The sight of the colossal European fortress rising from the beach is not one of relief, but final despair. It is a monument to cold, indifferent power, its cannons facing the sea, ready to repel any rival European. Its lower levels, carved into the very rock of the continent, are the infamous dungeons. For Naani, the transition from the sunlit dust of her home to the oppressive darkness of the dungeon is a total sensory violation. The air is thick with the stench of human waste, vomit, and the metallic smell of fear. Hundreds are pressed shoulder to shoulder, their bodies slick with sweat and the blood from wounds inflicted by the march. There is no language barrier. The language here is pure, unadulterated suffering. Here, a ritual of dehumanization is perfected. They are branded with the searing iron of the owning company, sometimes the Royal African Company, RAC, a mark of property forever etched into the skin. Stripped, shaved, and inspected, their physical bodies are now the sole focus of their masters. Muscle, health, and age, their culture, their titles, their history, all of it is systematically erased by the new name, often a cold, classical Roman moniker, or a simple functional designation like Kwasi. But in the darkness of the dungeon, beneath the roaring sound of the Atlantic waves outside the door of no return, Naani finds her purpose. Her spirit, the Sunsum, refuses to break. She recognizes other Akan, others who speak the Cromanti dialect, and together they huddle. They share stories of the Golden Stool, of the power of Niame, and they swear a silent, terrifying oath. If they survive the sea, they will never be slaves. They will carry the fire of Ashanti to the new world and build a new state, or they will die fighting. The British thought they were loading cargo. They were, in fact, loading an army.
The disembarkation was as brutal as the loading. Weakened, blinded by the sudden tropical sun, Naani and the other survivors were marched off the ship and into a pen for auction, the ultimate marketplace of human flesh. Jamaica in the 1720s was a landscape of pure, unadulterated greed. The land was dominated by the immense rolling fields of sugarcane, the white gold that drove the British economy. The rhythm of the island was the clanking of the sugar mills and the relentless crack of the overseer's whip. The average lifespan of an enslaved African in the Jamaican sugar fields was terrifyingly short. So short that planters preferred to continuously import new Africans rather than encourage reproduction. The island was a machine for turning human life into sugar and profit. Naani was likely sold into one of the great plantations, a landscape of manicured horror, where the labor was constant, backbreaking, and deadly. But for an Akan, fresh from the warrior culture of Ashanti,
This humiliation was a temporary state, not a permanent identity. The environment was hostile, but also offered opportunity. Jamaica was a mountainous island, largely undeveloped in the rugged interior. As early as the 1650s, when the British seized the island from the Spanish, enslaved people had been running away, cimarrones or Maroons. These Maroons had already established semi-permanent settlements deep in the hostile, mist-shrouded interior, particularly in the eastern Blue Mountains and the vast, inaccessible limestone karst landscape known as the Cockpit Country in the west. The Akan, or Coromante people, were the most feared and respected group of enslaved people on the island. Their history of successful resistance back home, their unified language, and their disciplined military training made them natural leaders of any rebellion. It was not long before Nanny, alongside her brothers and compatriots, men who would become legendary figures like Kojo or Kudjo and Amo or Akampong, they made their move. The details of their escape are lost, but the outcome is not. They did not run as frightened individuals. They escaped as an organized unit, carrying whatever tools and weapons they could seize, and heading straight for the bush, the wild, untamed interior that was the inverse of the plantation. Their first act of freedom was a solemn chromanti ritual performed in the deep cover of the forest, a vow of absolute, uncompromising resistance. They would not simply hide, they would build a nation. This marked the end of the captive. It marked the beginning of the warrior queen. Nanny, the Ashanti, was now Queen Nanny, and her war on the British Empire had just begun.
Chapter 5. The Cockpit Country continued. The planters of Jamaica, arrogant in their wealth and armed with the conceit of racial superiority, referred to the rugged interior as the wasteland. For Nanny and the Maroons, however, this wasteland was their salvation, a sanctuary and a weapon. The dense forests were not obstacles, they were living cover. The near vertical cliffs and deep gorges were not barriers, they were their ramparts. The Coromante warriors, led by Nanny, now simply Nanny to the British and Nana or Queen Nanny to her people, brought an inherited knowledge of survival. They did not clear the land to farm, they planted in the ruinate, small hidden clearings known only to them, using the system of shifting cultivation to ensure food security without a detectable footprint. They cultivated dasheen, yams, and bananas, and hunted the native wild pig, or hog, with incredible skill. The English soldiers, trained for open-field European combat, were useless here. Their bright red coats were screaming targets against the dark green jungle. Their heavy leather boots were liabilities on the wet, slippery limestone. They stumbled into expertly crafted traps, camouflaged pits lined with sharp stakes known as caltrops or man-catchers, tripwires that sent deadly logs swinging, and pathways designed to funnel them directly into an ambush point where they were met with a storm of musket fire and machetes. The Maroons were ghosts. They moved silently, using their bare feet or soft moccasins, and communicated in the field solely through coded drum beats or bird calls, a language the British could not crack. A patrol could pass directly through a Maroons encampment and never know it, feeling only a sudden, unshakable sense of being watched, of the air turning cold. This psychological warfare was as devastating as any bullet. Nanny, in this environment, was both a sovereign and a strategist. She knew the land's spiritual power, recognizing the hidden springs and sacred caves that became both vital water sources and places of ritual. She understood that while a man's body must be fed, his spirit must be nourished and armed. The ultimate goal was not merely to survive, but to create a permanent visible beacon of freedom. The time had come to formalize the resistance. The time had come for Nanny Town. Chapter 6. A Town is Born. The location of Nanny Town, later to be called Old Nanny Town, to distinguish it from a later, smaller settlement, was chosen with military and spiritual precision. Tucked deep in the Rio Grande Valley of the Blue Mountains, it was situated on a high, nearly inaccessible ridge, bordered by sheer drops on three sides, and accessible only through a single, narrow, heavily fortified path. The valley below provided fertile soil for planting, but the town itself was a citadel. The architecture of autonomy. The town was built in the traditional Ashanti style, adapted to the Jamaican environment. Houses were constructed of wattle and daub, thatched with local materials and scattered loosely within the compound to prevent a single cannon shot from devastating the community. But Nanny Town was more than just a cluster of huts. It was a functioning state. The Akan Court. At the heart of the settlement was a central clearing where Nanny held court. Decisions were made based on a fusion of ancestral Akan law and the brutal necessities of war. Justice was swift and discipline was absolute, a necessary condition for survival in a constant state of siege. The military structure. Nanny's authority was backed by her brothers and her top captains, notably Akampong and the brilliant, if unpredictable, Kojo, who led groups in the West. Nanny's genius lay in creating an integrated society where everyone, from the eldest elder to the youngest child, had a role in the defense and economy of the state. They were soldiers, farmers, healers, and spies. The spiritual center. Nanny Town was heavily protected by ritual. The town was believed to be shielded by an invisible spiritual dome. At the center of the spiritual defense was Nanny herself. She was the Akamfo, the priestess, the one who consulted the ancestors and prepared the warriors for battle. She ensured that the ancient spiritual practices, Obeah and Cromanti spiritualism, were preserved, not as superstition, but as a deep living connection to the motherland. The economic engine of freedom. Nanny Town wasn't a starving refugee camp, it was prosperous. The Maroons became self-sufficient in food, clothing, and even rudimentary weaponry. They established a thriving internal economy, but their external economy was built on daring raids. These raids were carefully planned and executed with surgical efficiency. Their primary objective was never just plunder, but liberation. A successful raid meant not only seizing gunpowder and tools, but more critically, freeing dozens of new recruits and their families, swelling the ranks of the Unconquered. Every person freed was a direct blow to the British economy and an addition to Nanny's labor force and army. The British feared these raids more than anything. The sudden appearance of highly disciplined, culturally unified Coromantee warriors who seemingly appeared from nowhere, killed the overseer, destroyed the mill, and vanished with 100 slaves, shattered the illusion of colonial control.
Chapter 7. The Spiritual Arsenal. The enduring legend of Queen Nanny is often framed by magic, but the Obeah she practiced and the Cromanti spiritualism that defined Nanny Town was not parlor tricks. It was a sophisticated, multi-layered system of control, morale, and psychological warfare that the rationalist British simply could not comprehend. The morale booster. For the Maroon people, Nanny's spiritual power meant divine protection. She would perform rituals before battle, guaranteeing her warriors invincibility, or at least the ultimate blessing of the ancestors should they fall. This unshakable faith that their queen was aligned with the powerful Nyame made them fearless. A man who believes his cause is just and his leader is divinely appointed will fight harder and more recklessly than an army fighting for a wage. The psychological weapon. The British officers and planters were terrified of the Coromantee black magic. Nanny and her warriors actively fostered this fear. They understood that the mind was the most vulnerable battlefield. Stories circulated among the enslaved and the planters alike. The impossible shot. Nanny could allegedly catch British musket balls in her hand and spit them back. The invisible town. She could make Nanny Town disappear, shrouding it in mist and confusing the trails for any pursuing British party. The gourd of rum. The most famous tale. Nanny, out of provisions, produced a massive, seemingly endless gourd of rum to feed her entire starving army, a symbol of the impossible provision she offered her people. These were not just stories. They were a deliberate military strategy. A British soldier marching into the mountains, already demoralized by the terrain and disease, and believing that his enemy was protected by supernatural forces, was already defeated before the first shot was fired. Chapter 8. The Maroons' Law. To sustain a revolutionary society, you must have order. Nanny Town was not a free-for-all. It was a state governed by strict, unyielding law that reflected the disciplined, hierarchical roots of the Ashanti nation. The fundamental law was the oath of blood, a sacred, secret ritual that every new member of the Maroon community was initiated into. It was an oath of absolute loyalty to the group, sealed with spiritual practices that ensured terrible spiritual consequences for any betrayal. This was necessary because the greatest existential threat to the Maroons was not the British Army, but the internal threat of the Kwashi, the term used for the enslaved person whose spirit had been broken and who might betray the location of the settlements for a promise of clemency. Key social codes. Mutual defense. Every man and woman was trained to fight. There was no professional class of soldiers. All were citizen warriors. Collective farming. The land was held collectively. Food was shared, and resource hoarding was a severe offense. This prevented internal strife and ensured the survival of the group over the individual. The Coromantee Code. The language and customs of the Coromantee were preserved and enforced. It was a deliberate act of cultural resistance, a way of maintaining the link to the Ashanti warrior identity that the British had tried to erase. In this community, Nanny was not just a leader. She was the living vessel of their heritage. Nanny Town, during its peak in the 1730s, was an anomaly, a self-governing, militarily successful African-descended state operating in open defiance of the British Crown, merely a few days' walk from the wealthy, powerful port of Kingston. The mere existence of Nanny Town was the most dangerous idea on the island. It proved that freedom was not a gift to be begged for, but a state to be seized and defended. Chapter 9. The First Skirmishes. The British colonial government, headquartered in Spanish Town, initially dismissed the Maroons as simple bandit gangs. This arrogant miscalculation cost them dearly. Nanny's strategy was not to engage in large-scale pitched battles, which would have favored the British artillery and superior numbers, but to wage a war of 1,000 cuts, classic guerrilla war. Tactics of terror and disruption. The ambush. Nanny's warriors would allow British patrols to pass through a narrow trail, then strike simultaneously from the high ground. The British, unable to see their enemy, would fire blindly into the bush, often hitting their own men. The goal was to inflict maximum casualties in the shortest time, then vanish, leaving the enemy with only their dead and their confusion. Targeted raids, they focused on disrupting the sugar economy. They would burn mills, destroy cane fields, and most importantly, free the enslaved labor. Each raid reduced the British profit and increased the Maroon army. The policy of no prisoners. For a time, the Maroons rarely took European prisoners, a brutal necessity of their survival. They could not spare the food or the guards, and they needed to send a clear message: submission was not an option. As the years passed, the Maroons grew stronger and more confident. The British realized that this was not a matter of a few dozen runaways. It was a full-blown military crisis. The governors were desperate. They raised specialized hunting groups, including other enslaved people and even Native American trackers from the mainland, and offered enormous bounties for Nanny, dead or alive. But Nanny was untouchable, not just because of her formidable army, but because her network of intelligence reached deep into the plantations. She knew when the British were mobilizing, where they were heading, and often what their tactical plans were, thanks to a flow of information from the enslaved people who remained behind. The small skirmishes escalated into true military engagements. The British began mounting large expeditions, hundreds of soldiers, cannons, and months of supplies, all dedicated to finding and destroying the invisible fortress in the mountains. By the late 1720s, the runaway problem had metastasized into the First Maroon War, 1728 to 1740. The plantation owners were no longer just losing property, they were losing control. The colonial assembly in Spanish Town was in open panic. The profits from sugar, the engine of the empire, were threatened by a handful of rebellious savages hiding in the mountains. The sheer audacity of the Maroons was infuriating. They were not just surviving, they were thriving. They were an African state within a British colony, and their very existence was an open invitation to every enslaved person on the island to break their chains. The British realized that they could not simply send local militias, they needed professional soldiers and a sustained brutal military campaign. In response, the Crown dispatched seasoned European officers and regiments, allocating vast sums of money to what they called the suppression of the rebellion. One of the key military figures deployed was Governor Edward Trelawney, whose name would become eternally linked to the conflict, though many other officers led the actual expeditions. The strategy shifted from hunting individual bands to a single devastating objective: finding and permanently destroying Nanny Town and the Maroon leader, Nanny. The soldiers were often veterans, but they were not prepared for Jamaica. Tropical diseases, malaria and dysentery, decimated the British ranks faster than musket balls. The relentless heat, the oppressive humidity, and the sheer impossibility of moving heavy supplies and artillery through the karst terrain turned the expeditions into nightmares. For every Maroon killed, the jungle claimed 5 redcoats. The British strategy was simple but costly: use their superior firepower to corner the Maroons. They established a chain of heavily fortified military posts deep in the bush, hoping to cut off the Maroon supply lines and starve them out. But the Maroons were masters of siege warfare in reverse. They would circle the forts, ambush the supply trains, and use their knowledge of the terrain to turn a defensive position into a tomb. The sight of their own dying comrades and the phantom-like attacks by an enemy they could never quite see plunged the British morale into an abyss. The British began offering huge rewards for Nanny: £1,000 and freedom to any enslaved person who could bring her in dead or alive. It was a tempting sum, a fortune, yet no one succeeded. Nanny was protected not just by the mountains, but by the pervasive, absolute loyalty of her people, and the fear she inspired in the wider enslaved population who dared not risk the spiritual wrath of the Okomfo.
The Maroons did not fight like soldiers. They fought like predators. Their military philosophy was the direct opposite of European conversion, making them impossible to defeat in detail. This was the strength of the Invisible Army.
After the fall of Nannytown in 1734, the Maroons entered their most challenging phase. They were not just fighting the British, they were fighting starvation and displacement. They lived scattered across the treacherous, uncharted peaks, constantly moving, using temporary camps, caves, and rock shelters for cover. This period was a brutal testament to Nanny's organizational strength. She ensured that communication lines, utilizing the Obeah horn and human runners, remained open between the scattered groups. Nanny's leadership was no longer about holding a territory, it was about maintaining a sense of nationhood in perpetual motion. Meanwhile, in the western cockpit country, the other great Coromantee leader, Cudjoe, maintained his own, equally formidable resistance. Cudjoe was the tactical counterpart to Nanny's spiritual strength, a brilliant, cautious, and fierce military commander. The British found themselves fighting two separate, coordinated wars in opposite ends of the island, a strategy that stretched their resources to the breaking point. The war of attrition continued, grinding down the British forces. Soldiers died not just from wounds, but from constant exposure, tropical illness, and psychological exhaustion. The colonial government was forced to acknowledge a bitter truth. They could not permanently defeat the Maroons. They could burn their town, but they could not exterminate them. Every time the British thought they had secured an area, the Maroons struck back with renewed fury, demonstrating that the fire of resistance was only scattered, not extinguished. The financial toll on the crown was staggering. The cost of maintaining the troops, replacing the damaged property, and losing the labor was crippling the Jamaican economy. The island, meant to be a jewel of the empire, was becoming a sinkhole of military expenditure. The colonial government reached a desperate conclusion. They had to achieve by diplomacy what they could not achieve by war. They had to talk. Chapter 14. The General's Defeat. In 1738, the new governor of Jamaica, Edward Trelawney, was authorized to seek a definitive end to the fighting. Trelawney was not a man of peace, but he was a pragmatist. He knew that if the Maroons were offered a binding treaty, they might agree to a truce that could save the British half of the island. The first attempts at contact were fraught with danger and suspicion. The British sent trusted emissaries, often enslaved men with promises of freedom, to find Cudjoe in the west. Cudjoe, known for his deep skepticism and hatred of the white man, initially refused. He required ironclad assurances and insisted on meeting Trelawney's representative, Colonel Guthrie, on his own terms. The meeting between Cudjoe and Guthrie was a masterpiece of tension, two military men meeting not as victor and vanquished, but as representatives of two hostile nations seeking an armistice. Cudjoe's demands were absolute, complete, perpetual, and documented freedom for his people. The result was the peace treaty of 1739, signed by Cudjoe. The treaty granted the Maroons of the West 1,500 acres of land in their current location, self-governance under their own chiefs, and perpetual freedom from slavery. Crucially, however, Nanny and the Eastern Maroons, still scattered and fiercely independent, had not signed it. The treaty with Cudjoe's group was not a total end to the war. Nanny, separated from Cudjoe's community by hundreds of miles of jungle, was wary. She had witnessed decades of British lies and brutality. Her conditions for peace were non-negotiable, and they were centered on the spiritual preservation of her people's original identity. Trelawney's men had to trek into the deep blue mountains to find the Queen of the Wind. They eventually located Nanny's new temporary headquarters, a community hardened by 5 years of brutal nomadic warfare. The second treaty, negotiated by Nanny, was different. It acknowledged her status as a paramount leader and secured a separate designated territory for her people. After the fall of Nannytown in 1734, the Maroons entered their most challenging phase. They were not just fighting the British, they were fighting starvation and displacement. They lived scattered across the treacherous, uncharted peaks, constantly moving, using temporary camps, caves, and rock shelters for cover. This period was a brutal testament to Nanny's organizational strength. She ensured that communication lines, utilizing the Obeah horn and human runners, remained open between the scattered groups. Nanny's leadership was no longer about holding a territory, it was about maintaining a sense of nationhood in perpetual motion. Meanwhile, in the western cockpit country, the other great Coromantee leader, Cudjoe, maintained his own, equally formidable resistance. Cudjoe was the tactical counterpart to Nanny's spiritual strength, a brilliant, cautious, and fierce military commander. The British found themselves fighting two separate, coordinated wars in opposite ends of the island, a strategy that stretched their resources to the breaking point. The war of attrition continued, grinding down the British forces. Soldiers died not just from wounds, but from constant exposure, tropical illness, and psychological exhaustion. The colonial government was forced to acknowledge a bitter truth. They could not permanently defeat the Maroons. They could burn their town, but they could not exterminate them. Every time the British thought they had secured an area, the Maroons struck back with renewed fury, demonstrating that the fire of resistance was only scattered, not extinguished. The financial toll on the crown was staggering. The cost of maintaining the troops, replacing the damaged property, and losing the labor was crippling the Jamaican economy. The island, meant to be a jewel of the empire, was becoming a sinkhole of military expenditure. The colonial government reached a desperate conclusion. They had to achieve by diplomacy what they could not achieve by war. They had to talk. Chapter 14. The General's Defeat. In 1738, the new governor of Jamaica, Edward Trelawney, was authorized to seek a definitive end to the fighting. Trelawney was not a man of peace, but he was a pragmatist. He knew that if the Maroons were offered a binding treaty, they might agree to a truce that could save the British half of the island. The first attempts at contact were fraught with danger and suspicion. The British sent trusted emissaries, often enslaved men with promises of freedom, to find Cudjoe in the west. Cudjoe, known for his deep skepticism and hatred of the white man, initially refused. He required ironclad assurances and insisted on meeting Trelawney's representative, Colonel Guthrie, on his own terms. The meeting between Cudjoe and Guthrie was a masterpiece of tension. Two military men meeting not as victor and vanquished, but as representatives of two hostile nations seeking an armistice. Cudjoe's demands were absolute, complete, perpetual, and documented freedom for his people. The result was the peace treaty of 1739, signed by Cudjoe. The treaty granted the Maroons of the West 1,500 acres of land in their current location, self-governance under their own chiefs, and perpetual freedom from slavery. Crucially, however, Nanny and the Eastern Maroons, still scattered and fiercely independent, had not signed it. The treaty with Cudjoe's group was not a total end to the war. Nanny, separated from Cudjoe's community by hundreds of miles of jungle, was wary. She had witnessed decades of British lies and brutality. Her conditions for peace were non-negotiable, and they were centered on the spiritual preservation of her people's original identity. Trelawney's men had to trek into the deep blue mountains to find the Queen of the Wind. They eventually located Nanny's new temporary headquarters, a community hardened by 5 years of brutal nomadic warfare. The second treaty, negotiated by Nanny, was different. It acknowledged her status as a paramount leader and secured a separate designated territory for her people. The Treaty of 1740. In 1740, Queen Nanny and the Eastern Maroons formally signed their own peace treaty with the British Crown. This moment was arguably the most significant victory for African resistance in the entire Western Hemisphere before the Haitian Revolution. The terms of the Unconquered. The treaty, later known as the Moortown Treaty, Moortown being the settlement that succeeded Nannytown, enshrined the following astonishing terms. Perpetual freedom. All Maroons under Nanny's command were declared free subjects of the Crown, never to be enslaved again. Sovereign land. Nanny's people were granted a specific tract of land, known as New Nannytown or Moortown, which remained their sovereign territory, free from the jurisdiction of the colonial assembly. Self-governance. The Maroons were granted the right to elect their own local leaders, chiefs, including Nanny herself, who would govern their community according to their own laws, traditions, and culture. No taxes. They were exempt from the colonial tax system. Nanny had forced the mightiest empire in the world to acknowledge her people's sovereignty and freedom, secured by decades of blood and fire. The treaty was a stunning admission of defeat by the British. They had failed to capture Nanny, failed to destroy her army, and failed to suppress the ideal of African freedom. The tragic compromise. However, all Maroon treaties contained a dark, tragic clause, a compromise that haunted their legacy. The return of new runaways. The Maroons were required to actively help the British put down future slave rebellions and, most painfully, to return any newly escaped enslaved people who sought refuge in their territory. This clause was a calculated move by the British to sow division between the free Maroons and the enslaved population, turning former rebels into agents of colonial order. It created an agonizing ethical and practical dilemma for the Maroons. Yet, it was the ultimate price of their hard-won sovereignty. For Nanny, who had spent decades freeing people, this requirement was a deep wound, but it was the necessary compromise to secure permanent, inherited freedom for her community. Chapter 16. The Free People. Life after the war brought peace, but not ease. The Maroons, now settled in their designated villages like Moortown, had to transition from a nomadic army into a settled, autonomous society. Nanny continued to serve as the spiritual and political leader of her people. The community focused on rebuilding its culture and economy. They reinforced the Cromanti traditions, the Obeah practices, and the distinct dialect that marked them as a people separate and apart. They were self-sufficient farmers, trading with the British settlements only when necessary. Nanny's existence was a living challenge to the entire colonial structure. She was the one woman the British could not conquer, a constant reminder of the failure of the white planter class. She enforced the community's laws with a strictness necessary for survival, presiding over the land court and the war council that transitioned into the peace council. The Maroons were now a unique military force. They had proved their loyalty to the treaty terms, sometimes brutally by hunting runaways, and were even utilized by the British in subsequent minor conflicts. This uneasy coexistence defined the next decades. They were free Africans in a world of slavery, enjoying rights and land ownership denied to the vast majority of the island's population.
Nanny's story transcended simple history and entered the realm of myth where her true power lay. To the British, she was a terrifying black witch. To her people, she was the mother of the nation. The spiritual power she wielded was the ability to unify, inspire, and maintain discipline. The legends of her catching bullets and summoning gourds of rum served a crucial purpose. They were propaganda of the self, ensuring that even when the British army seemed overwhelming, the Maroons never doubted their ultimate victory.
In 1975, Jamaica officially recognized her contribution by declaring her a national heroine of Jamaica, the only woman to hold this title. Her face is imprinted on the Jamaican $500 bill, making her, literally, a figure of sovereign currency. Her burial site, Bump Grave in Moortown, remains a sacred space for the Maroons, a place where rituals are performed to honor the ancestor who secured their permanent freedom. The site is a living monument to her legacy, a black woman who defied the prevailing power structures of the 18th century and won a war for emancipation decades before the term was even popularized. Chapter 18, Echoes in America. Nanny's saga holds particular resonance for the American audience, as it directly challenges the narrative of passive submission often imposed on the history of the enslaved. The news of the Maroons' success traveled quickly through the hidden networks of the enslaved in the Caribbean and up the coast to the American colonies. The success of the Maroons provided a blueprint for resistance. The mountain strategy, the idea of retreating to inaccessible terrain to establish self-governing communities, Maroonage, was replicated wherever possible, from the swamps of the American South, the Cimarrons of Florida, to the vast Quilombo settlements in Brazil. The Coromantee spirit, the aggressive, uncompromising resistance of the Coromantee people, became an inspiration for major slave revolts in the American South, notably the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, 1739, which was led by people of Angolan and Coromantee background. These rebellions were often an attempt to recreate the military success of the Maroons. The unbreakable will. Nanny's life proved that freedom was attainable through collective military action, not just legal decree. She became an unconscious ancestor to every major figure of American black resistance, from Nat Turner, who used religious faith to justify his righteous war, to Harriet Tubman, the military general of the Underground Railroad, who understood the tactical use of terrain and secrecy. Nanny's war fundamentally altered the power dynamic of the colonial era. It demonstrated that African people, armed with their culture and guided by brilliant leadership, could not only fight, but could win against the forces of global empire. The story is a powerful, factual correction to the history books, revealing an 18th century black revolutionary who achieved complete liberation for her people, forcing the Crown to sign a permanent peace treaty that still stands today.